I'm going to be talking to Frank Graves, president of EKOS Research Associates, about authoritarian populism and disinformation. This is a follow-up to a previous interview we've done about a month ago. So welcome to the interview, Frank.
Glad to be here.
Now, you've released some additional information that connects disinformation and people's attitudes, Canadians' attitudes towards vaccines. The first one you've got is support for sanctions against Russia by vaccine acceptance. What can you tell us about that?
Well, this obviously we would have thought in a normal world that your views about an issue like Russia's incursion into Ukraine would have very little to do with your views on issues such as whether or not you wanted to accept a vaccine or felt that vaccine passports were a good or bad idea. So I was not entirely surprised, but nonetheless quite surprised by how rapid and profound the gap which we saw between those who were not taking a vaccine or refusing vaccines, roughly 10% of Canadians, and their outlook on Russia, whether they thought it actually had justifiable reasons for its invasion of the Ukraine, whether or not they thought that Russia should be dealt with harshly in terms of sanctions, what their support for doing a range of things. Just for example, the most interesting, perhaps global indicator is we've asked Canadians a number of things about what should be Canada's response to the war in Ukraine, and the Canadians are pretty well on board with where the government has been. They strongly support aid. They strongly support both lethal and non-lethal equipment. They begin to get a lot more ambivalent when it comes to issues about whether we should be involved in a no-fly zone or whether we should have boots on the ground, which basically only small minorities, once we get to that level, support. But if we were to summarize across all the various ingredients of our response, which has received fairly high approval. You know, governments have a tough time getting approval these days, but about 60% of Canadians support the government's response, the federal response. And when we look at the instance of people who say, I'm not picking any of those choices, in fact, we shouldn't be doing anything, it's a pretty small number. But for those people who've had a vaccine, it's like 2% that don't have a choice of some kind of action, whereas it's 50% for those who are not vaccinated. And we see similar differences across the board.
Right.
So, yeah.
So I'll just, your first question is, should Canada impose tougher sanctions on Russia, even if it means higher prices and slower economic growth at home? The people who had 3 doses, 82% of them agreed that there should be tougher sanctions. But for vaccine refusers, 75% disagreed with that statement. That 75% of anything has got to be a big indicator for a pollster.
Yeah, I mean, in the language of statistical significance, seeing those kinds of massive differences, the probability that that's an artifact of chance is literally 1 in a million. It's there's clearly a very strong association. Whether it's causal or not, that's another question. But clearly, to me, seeing those sorts of profound differences emerging very rapidly, the only plausible explanation is that a lot of the individuals who are not taking vaccines are in fact getting disinformation from the same sources which are claiming, for example, that Russia was justified in its invasion, or that there are, bioweapons being manufactured in Ukraine, or there's Nazis there. All of those things, by the way, we're testing those and finding similar kinds of differences. We're in the field right now. So it suggests that disinformation, which was fueling a lot of the rejection of vaccines and vaccine measures such as passports, is now being, the disinformation fire is being trained on the Ukraine issue.
So does this mean, Frank, that basically there's 10% of Canadians who have fallen down the rabbit hole of misinformation, authoritarian populism, as you call it, and are susceptible, regardless of the topic, Could be anything. In this case, it's the Russian invasion of Ukraine, could be vaccines and vaccine passports, could be another issue that comes up. But these are the folks that are really vulnerable to misinformation.
Exactly. So, for example, even on, let's move to the issue of sort of vaccine passports or health restrictions. For those who in Canada who are well informed, answer a series of questions in an index that we measured. Basically, 100% of them are vaccinated, and very close to 100% think vaccine passports and masking are a good idea. That's about 30–40% of Canadians. As you move to the other end of the continuum, where everybody got all the answers wrong, the opposite occurs. Literally, nobody's been vaccinated, and 100% refusal or opposition to continued restrictions and so forth. Also linked to extremely high levels of mistrust of government, experts, and media. So they're not getting their information from, the Globe and Mail or the CBC. They're getting their information largely from social media, either on YouTube, channeling things like Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson, or they're just getting it, from other sources. But it's a very different, a complete polar opposites. Now, if it was just 10%, I'd go, that's disturbing, but that's not that threatening. If you still got, but it's not just 10%, because what happens, and that's why we're showing the evidence, interestingly, on those who've had 2 doses of vaccine as opposed to those who've had 3. And the gap between double dosers and triple dosers is every bit as big as the gap between those who've had no doses and everybody else. So along that continuum, a lot of people who have chosen to not get a booster, which is about half of Canadians, are also sharing, to a lesser extent, but to a significant extent, in the same disinformation channels and harboring a lot of the same views as those who have had no vaccination.
So if I were to summarize, Frank, it sounds like there's 30 to 40% of Canadians who are well informed and are making sort of what I would call rational decisions, coming to rational positions on various issues. Then there's a group in the middle that is the two dosers who are leaning towards misinformation, but not quite there. And then we have a small group that is completely mired down the rabbit hole, as I call it, and that's about 10%. And the danger here, I would think, is that more and more people, the 2 dosers, bleed into this 10%. Would that be fair to say?
It is. I would cut the numbers a little differently. I would say about 2/3, 60%, 65% of Canadians are what we would call the rational majority. They're relatively well informed. They're following the guidelines. They're saying this should be, our response to COVID should be driven by science and evidence. And they also would have similar attitudes on issues like climate change, a number of other factors, which are going to become prominent issues as we move out of the pandemic stage. Then as we move into the other 35%, and that number varies from the hardcore 10% who are basically hopelessly radicalized and don't have anything right and are operating in a world driven by spurious beliefs fueled by disinformation. There's a group of like-minded, but not quite there, who could be swayed to become members of this. And that's the key here. If we are more mindful of what's happening in terms of the rise and expressions of authoritarian, or what we call ordered populism, it doesn't need a whole lot more than about 1/3 of a society to become, the government of choice, or to be the government which, kind of makes decisions. And you can imagine in a government which is, kind of rooted in this constituency, keeping them happy, that honestly, we would probably find that there would be poor decision making. So, and in the extreme case, and I was just mindful reading Timothy Snyder's book on tyranny, which was published and talked about Ukraine, but before this episode, before the pandemic. It's a helpful sort of cautionary note to those who think that this sort of authoritarian right-wing populism, it's something, it's not that important. We sneer or deny it, but bluntly it is here. And even from the Freedom Convoy to this latest permutation, it's clearly a very important, perhaps the most important new political force in our country. And we should be concerned about that.
Right. So it's not an irritant, it's a threat. It's an existential threat to democratic institutions and processes, which leads me, of course, to the Conservative Party of Canada's leadership race, because Pierre Poilievre, who's clearly the front runner in this race at this point, has been courting that group, that the 10% that are radicalized, and that group that's leaning in that direction. He's received a lot of criticism for it. But now what it's interesting is his opponents like Jean Charest and Patrick Brown. You're seeing a little bit of that language creep into their campaign. How concerned should we be?
I think we should be concerned, and we can separate the issues of what's kind of a effective political strategy for securing government versus, what might be something we'd be concerned about in terms of what the impact of that kind of a government might be. To our way of thinking, based on the numbers, the Conservative Party have two legitimate paths to power. One is kind of staking themselves in what we would call the status quo conservative, the government, the part of the spectrum that believes in what have traditionally been a progressive conservative in Canada, but throughout similar problems in the United States. They believe in small government. They tended to be suburban, university educated, liked free trade. Stuff like that, believe more in individualism. That's really not what's going on with this new northern populist, kind of more Trumpian version, which are overwhelmingly economically pessimistic, hostile to outgroups, not particularly compressed by science or mainstream media. It's a very different collection. And they're about equal parts of the available constituency for the Conservatives. So all have to kind of pay some heed to this, but where you want to stake your foundation and grow is really much an open question. I mean, we've got the Patrick Browns, and we've got Jean Charest, who I believe want to resuscitate without totally alienating this group, want to restress the traditional status quo progressive conservative version. And then you've got obviously Mr. Poilievre, who's taken this alternate path, looking at what he would have seen as the failure of Mr. O'Toole, who kind of took the more centrification of the party. It looked really good for a while. They'd been ran into this collision on the issues of vaccines and guns that ultimately cost them power. Although remember, they didn't miss by very much. So this will be really important to watch. But in the short term, I don't really see these forces going away. They become stronger. And I think we have to think of ways of, kind of breaking out of this polarization and dealing with the core causes of why this is happening.
Well, let's get to that, Frank. What can we do? I know the last time I interviewed you, you talked about a New Deal, kind of something like Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal from 1933, because in your view, this has economic roots, the northern populism. So what should we do?
Yeah, it has economic roots. There's a lot of debate amongst those who study this, whether or not those are more important than the cultural expressions, and mostly things like, we call it hostility to outgroups, but frankly, it's more racism and worries about replacement theory. And, it's just a sense of my status and identity is being threatened. The social dominance that our groups used to enjoy is no longer a sure thing at all. So, dealing with the full package of issues is something obviously is not going to be dealt with overnight by any immediate response. But the areas that look most promising for a more medium-term solution are ones which recreate an economics of hope, where those individuals who say were members of the middle class by virtue of a strong back and a union card before all the deindustrialization, automation, free trade, and so forth, have a plausible path to feeling that kind of security and identity in the future. So I believe that's real. And I'm seeing in my data, for example, that there's tremendous support across both sides of the divide. And there's very few things where there's opinion views where there's common ground. But one of them is rebuilding manufacturing capacity in Canada. Canadians are worried about the fragility of global supply chains. They like the idea of doing more things within Canada. That could be quite innovative or it could be traditional. Another area where there's a lot of support on both sides of these polarities is addressing the issue of dealing with the hyper concentration of wealth at the top, taxing those billionaires that have, seen their position accelerating away from the average person as average wages have stagnated. So there's a lot of support for those, and that might be an ingredient of kind of a more permanent solution for this problem. We'll see if that occurs.
Final question, Frank, and I've done a fair amount of work in my journalism on narrative and the importance when you have a fear-based narrative, as you do in the populist movement. The only antidote to that is a hope and optimism narrative. And so, and that seems to be consistent with what you're arguing here. If there's the strategies, or maybe industrial strategies for rebuilding the economy tied to a hope and optimism narrative, maybe that's our best hope.
I would firmly agree. I don't see that as something that I see emerging right now, but I think the appetite for a more ambitious economics of hope is actually, as we come out of this pandemic, there's a lot of shared belief that we're not going back to the old normal, and that the new normal can actually be an improvement, which address some of the fault lines that were laid bare by the pandemic and creates, a better economy, a better society. I don't think we've got our attention on that yet, but I don't think it's that far away. And so that will be a really interesting ingredient of the debate about this contest for the future, because right now it's becoming a starker choice. Do you want this open kind of Canada, or do you want this more ordered kind of Canada? And I think we need to find a place where we find some common ground. And as I say, an economics of hope that can deal with some of the problems of polarization, which is being stimulated in an unhealthy way by disinformation. And all of that blend is something that's quite new and something we really need to get a better handle on.
Well, Frank, always appreciate your insights. This is, in my opinion, a critical, maybe the critical political discussion that we need to have in this country. And I look forward to chatting with you in the future as you continue your research on this.
Thank you very much. My pleasure.